And the gray line, I hope everybody's able to make out the different colors. The gray line indicates CKD stage 3, light blue, CKD stage 1, green, CKD stage 2, and CKD stage 4. So as we can see, most of them have CKD stage 3, and only a few of them have CKD stage 4. Why is that? It's because chronic kidney disease patients have a high risk of death, and before they progress to chronic kidney disease stage 4 or 5, they probably die because of other comorbidities. Next, please. And when the chronic kidney disease progresses to the most severe form called kidney failure, patients are diagnosed with ESRD, which is end-stage renal disease, and includes both dialysis and transplant patients. So in this slide, we have different years spanning from 2003 to 2015 on x-axis, and the point prevalence per million US residents. So in the last 15 years or so, there has been a steady increase in patients diagnosed with end-stage renal disease. Next. I just mentioned many people with chronic kidney disease have high risk of death, and just like in general population, heart disease is the most common cause of death in our chronic kidney disease or CKD patient population. And this graph shows how there is stepwise increase in cardiovascular death from stage 1 to stage 3 and 4 on the right-hand side. One important thing to notice is that within each stage of the chronic kidney disease, if there is severe proteinuria as reflected by this blue bar, there is a significant higher risk of cardiovascular death compared to no protein in the gray bar. So for patients who are on this call, when you visit your doctor, it's important to note if you have proteinuria or not, and pay attention to getting that proteinuria lower. Next, please. How about minorities and end-stage renal disease? This slide or graph has a lot of bars, but please focus on the right-hand side of the graph where we have the end-stage renal disease population split by their ethnicity or race. And as we can see, there are dark blue bars that stand out, which reflect Native Hawaiian and Pacific Highlanders, and followed by light blue bars, which represent African American ethnicity. And the smallest bar is brown bar, which represents whites. So as we can see, there is a disproportionate representation of minorities on dialysis or have received transplant. Next, please. So a logical question comes to our mind: why is that disparity? There's a lot of literature citing many reasons for that disparity or phenomenon. And if we break them down into patient level, societal level, provider level, it gives us some insight as to why that is observed. Patient level, it's been noted that there is a higher comorbidity burden in minorities, including diabetes and hypertension, which as we all know, are risk factors for CKD. And in the last 10 or 15 years, we've come to understand some genetic predisposition, especially in those with African ancestors, being attributed to APOL1 gene high-risk variants. We are all also familiar with societal factors where minorities are geographically disadvantaged to access healthcare or other healthy living resources. It was interesting for me to know that there is a provider level being attributed to provider bias when they're treating patients who are in the minority with inherent bias that results in late referral to nephrology, which might delay the care and rapid progression to severe kidney disease. Next. So what are the types of clinical studies? These are not unique to kidney disease, but whenever we are trying to understand clinical studies, we categorize them into clinical trial or an observational study. By the way, clinical study means there is involvement of human subjects, which we all probably know. In a clinical trial, there's always an intervention which is outside of medical care that is being tested. And an observational study is still a clinical study. However, there is no active intervention that is being tested, which is outside of routine medical care. Next. So a lot goes into approving a clinical study, or even before the approval, a lot goes into coming up with a clinical study. And it starts with a new idea, and it can be originated from local scientists or public entities like National Institute of Health or any foundation, or it could be from an industry or commercial entity. At university hospitals, we have studies spanning all these types of clinical studies. And then the next step would be the investigator proposes or writes up a protocol detailing what is going to be done, how the subjects are going to be recruited, procedure for how to capture the outcomes, in statistical analysis, and so forth. When that is done, the protocol is reviewed by each institution that is willing to participate in this study. And at university hospitals, we have a team of scientists, physicians, and it also includes lay people that constitute institutional review board. And this IRB is charged with reviewing the protocol thoroughly so as to advocate for the safety of the participants in the clinical study, including their health, safety of personal health information, and they also make sure that there is no, what should I say? They make sure that there is no specific injustice towards recruiting vulnerable population. Next. And once before a drug can be approved by the FDA, there are different phases that the clinical trial has to pass through, anywhere from early phase 1 to phase 4. And generally speaking, as a clinical trial proceeds through different phases, the safety and efficacy increases. So most of the studies we at the health centers participate are either phase 2 or phase 3, and uncommonly phase 4. Early phase 1 is, there is limited human exposure. It's like very early understanding of the drug. And phase 1 usually includes healthy volunteers looking for serious adverse effects and how the drug is handled by the body. Next. Phase 2 and 3 gain more understanding of how the drug acts. Next, please. And phase 4 is after the drug has been approved and post-marketing monitoring to gain more evidence as to the safety of the drug. Next, please. So one useful website is clinicaltrials.gov, where all the clinical trials across the world are usually listed on this site. So if anybody is looking for a clinical trial, they can go to this site, type in the condition or any other information, and search for relevant trials. Next. I typed in Apollo, which is a clinical study that I'm the PA of at university hospitals, and I came to find this through that website. Next. As I was mentioning, there is some genetic understanding that came forth in the last 10 years or so that relates to ApoL1, which is a gene we all have in our bodies. However, those of African American, those who are African American descendants could have high risk alleles related to ApoL1, and if they have 2 of them, it has been shown to cause high risk for kidney disease. Next. So at university hospitals, I've been recruiting donors who have donated kidney and recipients of kidney transplant who have received kidney from African Americans. And we're going to study how their genetic predisposition to ApoL1 high risk variants would affect their kidney function long term. Okay.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Sarabu. That was some really great information and a wonderful overview. I would like to introduce our next speaker, Jaleese Littlejohn-Thomas. She is the Research Community Outreach Coordinator for university hospitals, and she serves as a project manager for the IT, business, and strategy related projects and initiatives for the Clinical and Translational Science Collaborative. And she also manages the Clinical Research Policy Oversight Committee and Standard Operating Procedure Development Process. So please welcome Jaleese.
All right, good morning. Thank you so much for that warm introduction. It is a pleasure to have this space to talk with everyone about the importance of clinical research, safety, community outreach, and inclusive participant recruitment. I work in University Hospital's Clinical Research Center, Office of Research, Compliance, Education, and Outreach. I lead our outreach function, and we define outreach as the institutional first touch for all individuals who comprise our research community. And that includes principal investigators or physician scientists, study teams, caregivers, prospective research participants, and their families. Key topics that we typically discuss with principal investigators and prospective research participants alike are the importance of safety and inclusive recruitment. Laws, regulations, policies, and procedures have been enacted over time and are constantly updated to ensure research participant safety. We will discuss many of those laws shortly. The CDC recently declared racism a serious public health threat and shared efforts the CDC is leading to accelerate work to address racism as a fundamental driver of racial and ethnic health inequities in the United States. As we look toward lack of diversity, equity, and inclusion in healthcare, we see a direct link to lack of diversity in recruitment for clinical trials and opportunity for improvement in recruitment processes. Kicking off our exploration about research participant safety, we look toward ethical guidelines that help frame important topics related to voluntary participation in clinical research. The Nuremberg Code, Declaration of Helsinki, and Belmont Report provide our ethical foundation as researchers and research participants. So the Nuremberg Code was developed in response to the Nuremberg trials of Nazi doctors who performed unethical experiments during World War II. It was the first pivotal international document that provided guidelines on research ethics, requiring voluntary consent by a participant who is able to consent, free from coercion, who understands the risks and benefits involved in participation in clinical research. The code also imparted that researchers should minimize risk and harm, make sure risks do not significantly outweigh potential benefits, use appropriate study designs, and guarantee participants freedom to withdraw at any time throughout the trial. The Declaration of Helsinki was adopted by the World Medical Association during the 18th World Medical Assembly in Helsinki, Finland. It is comprised of 12 principles that guide physicians on ethical considerations related to biomedical research, with an emphasis on the distinction between medical care that directly benefits the patient versus research that is investigational and may or may not provide a direct benefit to the patient. The Belmont Report was issued by the National Commission for Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research. This commission was created as a result of the 1975 National Research Act that was signed into law as a result of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, another study that went against ethical and moral standards. The Belmont Report sets forth 3 principles underlying ethical research conduct: respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. When we think about respect for persons, the focus is on 2 considerations. 1, that individuals should be treated as autonomous agents, and 2, people with diminished autonomy are entitled to protection. The second principle, beneficence, is an obligation that research activities do no harm and maximize possible benefits while minimizing possible harm. And justice, which has taken on an even greater urgency in recent months, comes on the heels of the considerations of who should receive the benefits of research and who should bear its burdens. Numerous federal regulations support safe, ethical research requirements to protect research participants. Notable federal regulations include the Federal Right Assurance, policies out of the Office of Human Research Protection, and Food and Drug Administration. The federal policy or common rule for protection of human subjects requires that each institution engaged in federally supported human subject research file an assurance with the Office of Human Research Protection. The assurance formalizes the institution's commitment to protect human subjects. And this is something that Dr. Sarabou emphasized in his presentation as well. that, when an institution is conducting a clinical trial, they are taking on that obligation to ensure that participant safety is paramount. The Office for Human Research Protection provides clarification and guidance, develops educational programs and materials, maintains regulatory oversight, and provides advice on ethical and regulatory issues in biomedical and behavioral research. It promulgates the common rules for protection of human subjects, ensuring that protections are in place for human subject research conducted at or under the jurisdiction of an institution. The Food and Drug Administration protects the public health by ensuring safety, efficacy, and security of human drugs, biological products, and medical devices. It is responsible for advancing public health by speeding up innovation that makes medical products more effective, safe, and affordable. The FDA has 4 primary parts within 21 CFR that touch on human subject protections, with a focus on informed consent and additional safeguards for children. And they also are in charge of promulgating rules for institutional review boards, for example, setting forth standards for composition and operation of IRBs, review, marketing, and devices, and investigational new drug and device applications and exemptions. So when we look at research participant safety, it is at the core of the reason why we have these regulations, laws, and policies discussed so far. But once that framework is set, we look to the International Conference of Harmonization, Good Clinical Practice Guidelines, trial sponsors, local institutional review boards, and data safety monitoring boards for grassroots protection of human research participants, because without that oversight, we fail to collect high-quality data that impacts healthcare outcomes. So when we look at the ICH-GCP, they have the uniform standards for trial conduct, and they inform the regulatory framework for monitoring. Trial sponsors, so your Pfizer, Merck, all of these pharma companies, they are the primary responsible party for trial management. They ensure that data that's collected, for a multi-site trial, that it's comparable across the sites, and that your study personnel, so your coordinators and your nurse specialists, all meet training requirements, and they also ensure quality management. Your institutional review boards, they take steps to protect the rights and welfare of participants, both before the trial starts, so during review of the protocol, and also during the trial. So they do a periodic review as the trial is going on. And they also just are the spearhead for ethical review of research. And, a lot of physician scientists, sometimes when they're putting forth their protocol, they get a little bit frustrated when they have to make amendments and changes, but just know that that is all for the benefit of research participants. And then the Data Safety Monitoring Board, they review data that's accumulated throughout the trial. They assess general progress and safety and review efficacy by the treatment arms in the study. So what is good clinical practice? Good clinical practice is international ethical scientific quality standards for designing, conducting, recording, and reporting for any clinical trials that involve human subjects. And then here are some of the principles. So we already talked about the Declaration of Helsinki and making sure that the benefit justifies the risk of the clinical trial. We want to make sure that research participants' rights, safety, and well-being are paramount throughout the study, and that there's adequate information to support why the trial needs to be done. And that kind of really dovetails back into the importance of racial equity and inclusion in clinical trials. So from protocol design all the way to recruitment to execution of the study, and then research results dissemination, going back to the community, making sure that everyone understands that there is a benefit to participation. And why does diversity in clinical trials matter? Great question. And it's really, why does it, when you think about why any type of diversity in life matters, diversity in clinical trials matters for many of the same reasons why, we look at inclusivity. It means that outcomes reflect how each of us will react or not to a standard of care or treatment. If clinical research and trials do not include diverse populations, then we're approving drugs, devices, and treatments that may or may not work for everyone, and that's not okay. And if we look at these statistics, we see that racial and ethnic diversity of African American, Hispanic or Latino, and Asian American individuals makes up approximately 37% of the United States population and less than 7% of clinical trial participants. And furthermore, the types of side effects, how well a drug works, and the chance of causing side effects are all aspects of clinical trials that if we do not have diverse clinical trial participants, then we really, you're basically conducting a clinical trial once the drug or treatment has been approved. So we want to make sure that we have a very diverse set of people who are participating in clinical trials. Why aren't clinical trials more diverse? Now that we've laid out the importance of diversity in clinical trials, it's time to dig into the reasons why they're not. From lack of information and trust to lack of benefit and resources, these factors alone and or in conjunction make it challenging to recruit and retain diverse research participants. Prospective research participants need access to a healthcare system to know when studies are available. Dr. Sarabou emphasized that, there are clinical trial finders. You can go to clinicaltrials.gov to search. But again, when you're, dealing with regular life, you're working, maybe you're going to school, you have a spouse, you have kids, probably, the average person is not really thinking about going to clinicaltrials.gov to search for a study. However, if you do have a condition, or if you're just interested in, kind of the altruistic, being a part of the research data because you are someone who is of a diverse population, then, there are resources and there's information that you can access. If physicians are not telling diverse prospective research participants about studies they may qualify to participate in, it's unlikely that participants will seek them out naturally for many of the reasons I just kind of overviewed. And even when diverse potential participants have access to studies, studies show that they receive less information and education about them due to unconscious bias that makes it easier for physicians to kind of blame the lack of participation or mistrust on, the history found on pillars of systemic racism. And Dr. Sarabou touched on the kind of unconscious provider bias, and it's something that we're working very hard at university hospitals to tackle with our social justice and equity teams. And then once a patient trusts a physician enough to explore beyond passively looking at a pamphlet or flyer about a study, there may be questions about what the benefits are to the patient. Being that trials are purposed to explore investigational treatments, no promises can be made, but if there is a chance that the study will improve their quality of life or condition, that's pretty much all that, can be said, but it's worth that discussion. It's worth continuing to revisit that, even if a patient continuously does not, decide to enroll in the study, they still deserve to be aware of it if they're in that special population that is affected by this disease or condition. And then finally, we look at resources, lack of resources. The time and money burden that participation in a clinical trial may require eliminates many diverse potential participants who may not be able to take time off for visits. And this is not making an assumption. It's more so just when we look at the data and we, even when you look at COVID-19 and the populations that are more impacted by that compared to the majority, that's just the reality of the situation, and we have to meet people where they are. So how do we increase diversity in clinical trials? The FDA released guidance on how to make clinical trials more inclusive and cited the following recommendations. They said that we needed to widen eligibility criteria, build relationships with community-based medical centers, use technology, connect with patient advocacy groups, support diversity-focused public policy, and make diversity an internal mandate. We recently started a clinical research community advisory board at UH where we connect with prospective research participants and gain feedback on everything from website navigability to better ways to recruit for clinical trials. We use technology and social media to be a constant presence of education and awareness about clinical research. And then through outreach and engagement at health fairs and one-on-ones, we start conversations that were not had in the past, opening doors to opportunity to collaborate. And that really is the key there. When you think about how you might have made friends when you were in grade school, you started a conversation with them. And then over time, that conversation allowed for greater exchanges of information and vulnerabilities. And that's how you form that relationship of trust so that, if your friend said, let's go down this high slide, maybe you didn't do it on day 1, but on day 20 you did, they encouraged you. And I think the same kind of relationship is the same pillars that we think about friendship relationships are what we need to establish with members of the community and especially diverse subsets so that we can build that trust that is lacking and contributing to lack of participation in clinical trials. And Finally, as a part of our social justice and equity experts that I mentioned, many CRC staff members sit on subcommittees to break down institutional barriers that directly and indirectly impact the diverse populations that we serve. So we're doing the good work that needs to be done and meeting it with urgency. And now, major government institutions are continuing to push out data that supports why this is such a critical need. And here are a few links to some of the information that I referenced throughout this chat. I see there are a couple, I saw there were some alerts in the chat, but now I will pass on to our final presenter. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Jaleese. That was wonderful. I would like to introduce our next presenter, Kevin Fowler. He's worked in the pharmaceutical industry for over 25 years in both the commercial and R&D organizations. He formed his own patient advocacy and patient engagement consulting business in 2014, The Voice of the Patient Incorporated. Based on his personal experience of having a preemptive kidney transplant in 2004, he has a deep passion for patient advocacy and patient engagement. He was actually selected to be a patient editor for the Clinical Journal of the American Society of Nephrology. So please welcome Kevin Fowler.
Thanks, Molly, and thank you for the invitation. And can you see my slides?
Not yet.
All right, so I've got to hit a button. My apologies.
Yep, share screen.
Yeah, I'm just trying to find where that is.
It should be at the bottom or the top.
Yeah, I'm just trying to, for whatever reason, I am, let's see. No, that's not it. Is there any way that you could just take control and then I could just ask you to advance the slides?
Absolutely. Give us 1 second.
Thank you. Sorry about that. And I'm going to
No worries.
Yeah, and I'm going to, a lot of the comments that Jaleese mentioned, I'm going to try to touch upon some of those so that there's, coherence in what we're talking about, because I think what's interesting, what Jaleese was talking about diversity, but when it comes to kidney disease, people that African American, Hispanic, Asian really represent, a large majority. So we say diversity, it's really representing the people that have the actual disease. So I think that there's a huge need to improve representative enrollment. So could not agree with any more you said, Jaleese. And just let me know, Molly, when you have it up there.
All set? Go ahead.
Okay, got it. All right, great. So what I'm going to talk about is engaging patients in kidney disease clinical trials. And related to this topic, this is the outline that I put together. So the first part, I want to talk about the executive order on advancing American kidney health that was issued back in July of 2019. And when we talk about clinical trials, I'm going to talk about upstream intervention, meaning intervening before you go into dialysis. And so you're slowing down the progression of kidney disease. And then the last part is just then talking about the role of nephrologists and patients have in clinical trials. And I'll just add this comment based on my professional experience. Patients are not the problem when it comes to enrolling in clinical trials. And I'll get to that in just a moment. So when the executive order was issued back in 2019, I think one thing that continues to be overlooked is when you look at the third aim of the executive order, and that was reducing the risk of kidney failure. So essentially what this arm or this aim aims to achieve is to identify kidney disease earlier, so interventions can be done earlier, and encourage the adoption of treatments to slow down the progression of kidney disease. And one good example where the utilization of medications, ACE inhibitors and ARBs that are used when people have proteinuria, those medications, even though they're widely available and very inexpensive, they are still suboptimally utilized. So, to be very frank with the audience, is that our system of care in the United States really did reward renal failure. And it was not really serving the best interests of patients. So that's why I feel so strongly about the importance of early detection if we want to change and have a system that really reflects the needs of people that have it. And this was actually, as a follow-on to that point, a couple of months later, there was a KDIGO conference on the early intervention of kidney disease. And so the people that were in this audience represented a diverse group of people from all over the world that came together. And if you want to learn about this report, the KDIGO controversies report is available online. Just type in KDIGO and you'll find this. And the findings from the meeting were unanimous, is that the evidence supported systematic approaches to screen, risk stratify, and treat people with CKD. And just to be clear, that's not being done all the time in the United States. There's a long way for us to go to achieve that. The other part was to focus upon strategies to maximize deployment of CKD screening, risk stratification, and treatment efforts. And the point I always say is, if you look at our system, there's been very little investment on the front end of kidney disease. So that was the second part. And then the third part was looking at pragmatic trials that would test out these early intervention approaches to see what the impact of those were across various high-risk populations. And then the last recommendation was large-scale randomized clinical trials that would again evaluate the impact of this. So this recommendation, and you know, it's kind of hard to believe, but there are people in the community that have not embraced this, which is really kind of hard to comprehend. And so I would just encourage anyone on this call that is interested in kidney disease, especially if you're a person of color, African American, Hispanic, I would encourage you just to read about this and advocate for the system of care that serves our best interest. So I'm going to transition here to a survey that I actually, back in 2016, I presented at Kidney Week at the American Society of Nephrology, and it was on this topic. And one part of the presentation is I touched upon a survey that I did with people about clinical trial participation. So I surveyed approximately 190 people, 192 to be exact, for this survey to get their input on clinical trials. And if you look at the distribution of the respondents, you know, there was, you know, predominantly white or Caucasian population. You know, African American population was approximately 9%. Here's the Hispanic. So certainly there could have been a better representation, even though I made an attempt to broaden this. And I'm actually thinking about maybe doing this again, because, you know, this is an area, like as Jaleesa has mentioned out, there's a lot of trust issues about clinical trials that I think really can be solved one relationship at a time. But so when I surveyed this audience, I surveyed a number of different subjects. And one of the areas, well, one of the things to give you some background on what their state of kidney disease was, is that this is a breakdown of what their stage of kidney disease. So there was a good representation of people that still were at CKD that had not progressed to kidney failure. This is a breakdown by people that have had a transplant or on dialysis. So it was a pretty good representation of people that had not yet advanced to kidney failure. But when I asked the question about, have you ever participated in a clinical trial, not surprisingly, I would say about a third of the audience said they had. A couple of people said they didn't remember, but the overwhelming majority of people said that they had not been in a clinical trial. And then when I probed further and said, you know, for people that, why did you participate in a clinical trial? You know, I just really like to highlight this point right here, is that the number one reason why people participate in trial is that they wanted to give something back. And I think a lot of times people will say, well, we need to compensate people and that will solve things. And I think it's what Jaleesa was talking about. It's much deeper than that. I think that, in my opinion, people who've participated in clinical trials have not really been treated as an equal stakeholder. And I think that's part of the problem. So, you know, when you look at people who choose to be in a clinical trial, my sister was just recently in one, you know, the system really is not intended to really recognize and treat these individuals. And I think this is an area that needs to change. So when you look at people that make this decision, they are really thinking for the greater good. The other area that when I asked him, as I said, you know, asked the question is, how did you learn about the clinical trial that you participate in? And the number one reason was their doctor. And I think that, in my opinion, that reflects a lot of the trust that people place with their physician. But there's also an expectation is that their doctor is going to inform them of everything that's happening out there. And so the level of trust that nephrologists have with patients to be in a trial is quite high. And I think there's an opportunity for people in the community that are nephrologists to make sure that they're offering these patients these clinical trials, because this is the only way things are going to change for kidney disease and to move away from kidney failure. And then the other question was asked is that after you completed the trial, were the final results shared with you? And overwhelmingly, the results were no. And I'll give you another case in point. My sister was in a recent trial, and these results were published at a meeting, and she found out about the results after I told her about it when I attended this meeting. So I think that if you think about like basic things that people like to know, I think it's a natural question or natural response to have, that if you're in a clinical trial, that you would like to know what was the impact of your contributions to that trial. So I think when we're looking at ways to help improve it, I think this is just another example of how to improve the process, is making sure that people that are in the trial understand what the results were. Then if you look at the next question was, after the trial was completed, were you recognized for your participation in the trial? And again, overwhelmingly, the response was no. There was some people that did have the results recognized with them. So I asked this, then the follow-up question is that, would you like to be recognized for completing a clinical trial? And, again, most people said they would like to. I don't think that's a unreasonable request for people to make, but this is what, people were asking for, is just to be recognized. And then the question was asked, how would you like to be recognized? It was just simply a thank you letter would be sufficient. If you look at other, actually a good number of these responses could also be linked to a thank you letter. Compensation was listed here, but really it's just a basic thing of thanking the person in respect for their willingness to make a sacrifice for the greater good. And so if I then ask the question too, if you've not participated in a clinical trial, what was the reason? And the number one reason was my doctor or care team never discussed it with me. And so I think that, that there are different initiatives happening right now to have, obviously resources available online like clinicaltrials.gov, but to participate in a clinical trial many times requires a conversation with the person, the patient places their trust in. And that in this case is the nephrologist, they're putting their trust there. So I think that, this, again, looking at the reason why patients aren't participating in trials is the doctors never had the conversation. So I always say is that if you look at clinical trial participation, don't blame the patient. The patient's not the problem. It's the system that needs to be adjusted, similar to the work that Jaleesa has been doing in terms of including participants early up in the design of the protocol and so forth. And so if you have not participated in a clinical trial, what would influence you to enroll in the study? And a simple part of having the doctor explain the clinical trial to the patient. So I think what I have also found from my own experience is that I think that there is some paternalism that takes place in kidney disease, meaning that that sometimes doctors don't think patients want to take any risk in clinical trials. And what my experience has been recruiting for several clinical trials is that most patients are aware of what their current disease and how it's going to progress. And they're looking at options that can change that patient journey so that they can have some element of hope for a better life. So that's another thing I think it sometimes gets in the way, is sometimes the physician making assumptions of what the patient may want to assume in terms of risk. And then I will just come to the end of this and just say is that I think when you look at the burden of kidney disease, I don't think the burden of kidney disease has really been adequately understood by the community. And I'm going to draw upon one element here, and that's the issue of cognition. The evidence supports that as your kidney function declines, that there's an impairment many times for people on their cognition. If they go into in-center hemodialysis, the studies show that blood flow to the brain is stunted. So patients aren't getting all the blood to the brain. And if they're fortunate like me to even have a preemptive kidney transplant, the medications that you take post-transplant, one of the medications has a high impact on neurotoxicity. And I would just say that there's also the economic element of kidney disease that we sometimes lose sight of, is that if you're someone who goes into dialysis, the overwhelming majority of people on dialysis are not working. So that's why I'm so passionate about changing the patient journey. And it starts with clinical trials, and it starts with treating people in these trials as equal stakeholders. So as you can tell, I have a very strong opinion on this, and I believe this with all my heart. And if you have any questions, this is my contact information. And if you're on Twitter, that's my Twitter handle. And if you're not on Twitter, I encourage you to get in there. There's a lot of great conversations happening in nephrology. So, Molly, thanks.
Okay, thank you so much, Kevin. That was a lot of really good information. Right now, if anyone has any questions, please put them in the chat feature. We'll give it just a moment to let some people type in any questions that they may have. In the interim, I do have one question, and Jaleese, you might be the best person to answer this. On average, how long does it take to get approval from the IRB board to get a trial started?
That is a really good question that does not have a concrete answer. But, you know, with COVID, we've seen some miraculous timelines. I mean, I think I heard anecdotally that, you know, as fast as a couple of days for COVID, but of course we know that's a special case. But I would say on average, you know, taking into account the phase of the study, the complexity, you know, if it's greater than minimal risk, maybe a couple of weeks to a month. But I think I'm being really liberal with that. And if I'm being more conservative, we'll say 2 to 3 months.
Okay, that's great because, you know, I know there's usually, it does take time. Obviously, there's a lot, as we learned today, involved with managing and starting a clinical trial. And that kind of helps too, I think, with give people, you know, who may be considering participating in a clinical trial, some information about, you know, it takes a while to get things going. So far, I am not seeing any questions in the chat feature. So we're almost at the end of the session. Just a quick reminder, for those who are seeking continuing education units or SEPSIs, please do click on the link in the chat feature that will take you to the survey. You will also be prompted to complete the survey once you exit the meeting as well too. Either which way is fine. It'll take you to where you need to go. For also more information about one of our sponsors, please go to their website, www.philoxis.com. And we do have a question to all the panelists. How do we get the word out about clinical trials into the community where the patients are, especially those communities that are geographically far from a major medical center that has an established clinical trial infrastructure? So I will turn that over to the panelists.
Jaleese, you go.
Oh, okay. So that is literally part of my job. And, you know, it's, as Kevin can probably agree, it is a work in progress. But the key thing is, you know, using technology and understanding that if there is a technological breakdown somewhere, there are resources out there. Like in Cleveland, we have this company called Digital C, and they are doing some research on digital literacy. And then there are computer nonprofits that will get computers out there to people that don't have access. So if we're thinking in terms of that, there's ways to, it would take a lot of work, but it's worthwhile work because it's building that infrastructure. And then it just takes having people who have that outreach heart or outreach in their title to physically go out to those places, have one-on-one conversations with, prospective physician scientists if they're not already doing research, making sure you have that research compliance education foundation so that everyone is trained up and can at least have, a conversation with a prospective research participant or physician that just lays out the basics about clinical trials and clinical research. And then really just always pushing and driving hard about the urgency and importance of connectivity to resources. So I would say that those are kind of some somewhat low level things that you can do that don't take too much out of you in terms of whatever your main job is, if your job is not outreach.
I would just add what Julie said. I mean, she said it well, really well. I would just say is, telehealth is now happening much more in clinical trials. So that's been a positive thing because of COVID. But I think it's just a matter of making it a priority. I mean, it's, I think it's just a matter of making the investment in time in those communities and building trust and respect. I just think sometimes a lot of people will want to come at the last minute, and ask people, but you haven't spent time developing the relationship. And I just think it's a matter of making that a priority. And I also think it's just saying is that, there's no guarantees, but I think there's a better path there may be a better path for your disease, right? And I think in the case of kidney failure, challenging people to say, this doesn't have to be the path of you going on dialysis, right? So anyway, that's my 2 cents.
Okay, great. Dr. Sarabu, did you want to add anything?
No, actually, the other 2 panelists summarized it very well. I don't have anything else to add. Thank you for asking.
Okay, that's it for the questions. And I would like to thank our panelists again today for their fabulous information, our sponsors, the Ohio Commission on Minority Health and Veloxis and Hospitals Transplant Institute. So again, just one more final reminder, please click on the link for the survey, especially if you want CEUs. And that's it for today. Thank you again. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.